Welcome and thank you for joining us on the Investment Migration Report. Today we have as our special guest Michael Bailkin, who's of counsel with the law firm Ackerman and also the managing principal at REIT Strategic Development. Welcome, Michael, and thank you for being here with us today.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I look forward to this discussion.
Well, Michael, I know we've been working together for the past 6 or 7 years, but I know you've been involved in economic development both as an attorney and both on the government side as well as a developer. Do you mind just giving us a quick background about your background in economic development and your how you came about to getting involved in EB-5 program?
Wonderful. Well, thank you. I really started off in the public sector. Initially on the Roosevelt Island Development Project in New York City. I became deputy counsel to that project when we were first developing it. And then after a stint at a law firm, I went into the city government and ultimately became head of economic development for the city in the Beam administration, which was a very interesting time because we were going through a bankruptcy then. Effectively, the city had shut down. So I had the opportunity both to work with the team that was trying to restore fiscal stability to the city, as well as building up the economic development programs that would eventually kickstart the economy again. So we're working on it from both ends, both from the standpoint of cleaning up the bond market and letting the city get back into the bond market, as well as stimulating developers and investors to start investing capital back in. And it turned out that the first project that we were using to stimulate that development was the Commodore Hotel, which was Trump's first project, and the mayor appointed me to be the city's lead negotiator on it. Took about a year to get through, and basically we used that project to create a program called the Mayor's Investment Program, that became available to all developers, and it stimulated a few $1 billion worth of construction right after that. So the combination of putting the city back in good fiscal shape, as well as the stimulus of those various programs, which were initially tax-oriented, but developed a number of other techniques as well, it really created, I think, the basis of a good economy. After doing that and finishing up that program, I started a law firm called Bailkin, and Dave Statmar, by the way, had been the head of economic development for the New York State Urban Development Corporation, and we met on the Commodore Hotel project. He was my counterpart on it because we needed state powers to accomplish the incentive that we wanted to provide. And for many years, Bailkin focused on economic development. We had a national practice. We built up a boutique practice, and we're sort of the go-to firm in New York for that, but it was primarily a New York-based program, and in many ways an outer borough program. Those incentives have changed radically as New York became a more powerful city. So as Mayor Bloomberg said when he first came in, who had been a client of mine, by the way, before that, he basically said, look, we don't have to pay people to come into the city. They should be paying a premium to be here. And consequently, most of the economic development programs, at least the ones that were more meaningful in terms of delivering assistance, were put by the wayside, and most economic development was then focused on both outer borough development as well as major projects as opposed to corporate retention. We folded Ackerman we folded Statmar Bailkin into Ackerman about 15 years ago, and it was a pretty good move for everybody. All my partners became partners at Ackerman, and I came in as of counsel so I would be able to do projects, because the very nature of an economic development project or an economic development practice leads you into the business of real estate. So I've sort of led a dual career since then. Started a company called Abteen Strategic Development, but up until then, my most important project was Metratech, which turned out to be a 9 million square foot back office and tech operation done with Far City Ratner. We basically did that from working with Polytechnic University, which was going to leave Brooklyn to go to Farmingdale. I convinced them to say, you want to stay in Brooklyn, and we'll use your university to create a dynamic project around it that will utilize the skill sets of a lot of your academics and students, and that worked out very, a very successful project. As I said, they developed 9 million square feet. And since then, I focused on those kind of projects. That project was the first example where a private developer privatized the urban renewal process. Until that point, the way you did urban renewal was you used federal dollars, the city condemned land, and then they did a master plan and they tried to get developers to come in. And the problem with that, it wasn't really market oriented. It was planner oriented, and excuse me, millions of dollars were spent on land acquisition and relocation. So this was the first time where a private developer took the initiative, but used the urban renewal process. But we put up all of the front end capital to do the plans, and we got the urban renewal process done in record time, but basically a year from start to finish. And we got our first client in, which was Morgan Stanley. We took one of the initial projects, and that project is now history. Since then, I've been focusing on a combination of doing economic development service providing, where I act as a lawyer or consultant for individual projects. And in that process, I've used EB-5 in a number of different projects, both as a consultant on some of my own projects, and really believe that there's a role for EB-5, particularly in today's environment where you have opportunity zones. And I think there's a tremendous interaction between, on the one hand, the federal opportunity zones, as well as similar type zones that states and localities designate, as well as combining the EB-5 investment capital along with various forms of subordinated public capital. And I guess we can jump into that. I'm sure you'll have a few questions specifically as to how those pieces fit together. But that's sort of perhaps a longer overview than you might have asked for.
Sure, no, that's great. Thank you, Michael. And I think for our audience, maybe just mention what year that Commodore Hotel project was done.
That was 1975, 76. The project went into construction in late 1976 and 77. But that was, as you can recognize from those dates, that was the middle of the city's bankruptcy.
Right, and former President Trump, I guess that was his first project. How old was he at the time when he was doing this?
He was a young man then. He was younger than me. I guess he was about 22, 23, maybe a few years older.
Interesting. And I think, Michael, since you've been, involved in economic development for such a long time, what are some of the other, good economic development programs other than EB-5, and maybe compare and contrast EB-5 to some of the great programs that help, generate economic activity, foreign investment, and really help revitalize, forgotten cities?
Well, let's start with the federal level. There was really only one federal program that I've liked that gave the flexibility to do economic development. I think when you're talking about using incentives, you need tools that are flexible and tools that allow for some discretion, both within government and the private entrepreneurs to interact so they can really make the incentive to generating the investment. That project was, or that program was UDAG, Urban Development Action Grant. Now, most of you are probably too young to remember that program. We used it back in the late 70s and early 80s when it was at its heyday. And I probably put together maybe about $400 million of UDAG grants at that time for various clients. And what was good about it is that the money, it was actual capital that came in, usually came in as a grant so that it was subordinated. And it enabled a lot of projects to go forward, particularly in the early days. They were focusing on downtown hotels. Places like Cincinnati, Cleveland were all generating a hotel market that had never existed in many of those cities. So UDAG eventually phased out. At one time, I brought into my law firm the former director of UDAG after he had retired from government, but the program itself kind of tapered off. And it's only EB-5 that gives me any, EB-5 and the Opportunity Zone programs are the ones that seem to me the most productive federal interactions, or the federal stimulus. Usually the feds have very uh, rigorous and straightforward programs and a lot out of HUD to accomplish specific goals. But I think both UDAG, EB-5, and OZ really enable you to do a very broad range of development and a broad range of businesses and communities. And in all cases, particularly for OZ and UDAG, you can invest the money in businesses as opposed to straight real estate deals. So far, I think that EB-5, and you know better than I, but I think EB-5 has been used only, or if not primarily, for real estate. But one should start to consider whether it makes sense from both the investor standpoint and the sponsor standpoint to use EB-5 as capital in operating businesses.
Great. And Michael, I know, I think a lot of us in the EB-5 business were under the impression that President Trump would come in and fix the EB-5 program, given his real estate background. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. But one thing that I think was significant in the previous administration was the fact that they did pass the Opportunity Zone program. And I think a lot of people have known that this program was something that they were trying to pass all the way back to the Reagan administration. But finally, they were able to get it done under the last administration. Could you maybe weigh in on that a bit?
Well, I'm more familiar with the OZ program. EB-5 sort of went quiescent during the last administration. I think it was probably a number of things. I think it was less a government issue than it was the fact that we had so much retrogression from China and then political issues with China that kind of shut that market down. So I think from my view standpoint, the problem really came not so much from the government, but from the change in dynamics from China for the most part. I think that the big issue from the Trump administration was the OZ program. And we've worked very closely with the OZ team, particularly with Jaron Smith, who was running the program from the White House. Our firm has sponsored a number of conferences to sort of connect the federal team with local communities. As you can imagine, the Republican administration trying to go into inner city Detroit wasn't always welcome there. So Jaron reached out to our team, particularly one of my partners, Don Cogswell, to start to do outreach to those kind of cities. And we worked in about 10 or 11 cities, including Miami, Philadelphia, of course, Detroit, Atlanta, Houston, places like that, where our main job was to create connectivity among the main stakeholders there. One of the key issues that we were always pushing, aside from the issue of connectivity and bringing together good projects and trying to stimulate investment from private investors who had capital gains, was how do you make the projects feasible? And what we found is that the tax benefits by themselves, in my view, were not enough to really stimulate development in many of these areas. And as a result, what you had is that most of the OZ projects are really not core OZ projects. They're really on the periphery. A lot of market rate housing has been done. A lot of hotels have been done. Less so after the pandemic hit. But the main stimulus for OZ was really private market capital for projects that probably would have been occurred anyway, and they really didn't have that much impact on the community. So towards the end of the administration, and particularly with Jaron Smith's push, there became a new emphasis on trying to get into core projects that really would be transformational for communities. But in order to do that, the dynamics and the investment criteria are radically different than just for market rate housing. So essentially it means that you have to put in a lot of supplemental capital, some of which would come from local government. The problem is that while many local governments like Philadelphia and any of the cities have their own programs, they're all under fiscal strain. So there's a lot of difficulty in raising the levels of capital that you would need, and in the flexibility, as we'll see when we're talking about the capital stack, of putting them together in the right way. EB-5 would be terrific for those kind of projects because EB-5, generally from a developer standpoint and an investor standpoint, provides subordinated capital that enables them to reduce their equity requirements and put the capital stack together, and also induce lenders to come in. The problem is that just at the time where there was a recognition from the federal government and many states and localities that you needed this kind of supplemental capital to make OZ work, and where there became a political dynamic to favor those kind of projects, the EB-5 program was tapering off. So that was less available on a substantial basis than it had been before. So what you really had was the heyday of EB-5, where a lot of capital was coming in, but also because of the rules that enabled you to do TEAs in areas that really weren't depressed. Most of that capital went into projects like Hudson Yards or Silverstein's project in Lower Manhattan. And it's only as the EB-5 project started to develop and again focused like the OZ program on more impacted areas that the EB-5, the availability of capital started to taper off. So I think the goal, as I would see it from my perspective as a developer and service provider, is the continuation of the OZ program with a greater emphasis on it, both from the federal side, who can provide additional incentives, to supplement the tax benefits. At the same time, really structuring the EB-5 program and putting it together in a way that it's going to be a great capital raising mechanism, particularly to be focused on supporting OZ projects. That seems to me the dynamic that can both produce public policy as well as good investments.
This is a very interesting topic, and of course, in light of your vast experience, I mean, we're glad to have you here so we could ask all the questions that I'm sure a lot of the investors want to know as well. This is something, capital stack is something I really get into with the investors because they want to understand what they're investing in. So you had mentioned that including EB-5 in the capital stack can induce institutional lenders to lend. I was wondering how institutional lenders react to the use of EB-5 in a capital stack, and how you could use EB-5 to maximize benefits to developers and acceptability to lenders as well.
Well, it's a great question, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a complicated answer because there's different views on this. The basic issue is that on the one hand, lenders like subordinated capital, because it enables them to essentially give a lower loan to value on a project. So developers are always under tremendous pressure to limit their own equity. Equity is always hard to raise in the current environment. Most equity is provided by third-party sources rather than by the developers themselves. So what the developers need to do is limit that equity. It's a cost to them. And at the same time, the banks want to have a lot of subordinated capital in because they don't want to be the primary at-risk holders. So there's always been a dynamic as to how much loan to value there would be. At certain times, banks would loan as much as 80 or 90% of the capital, and then particularly after the 2008 recession, those numbers crept back considerably. So on the one hand, banks welcome having a lot of money behind them. On the other hand, there's been some concern about having EB-5 investors having a role in the project, and which is why a lot of the banks will no longer allow EB-5 to take a real estate position. So a real estate position means that ideally, investors would like to get at least a mezzanine loan position where they have some legal rights if the project goes under. On the other hand, that requires an intercreditor agreement with the first lender, and most first lenders are reluctant to do that. I'm not saying that they all are like that, but in my experience, more times than not, the lender will not allow an EB-5 investment group to take a mezzanine position, and therefore EB-5 has usually come in as pref equity, which means that it's structured like a loan because we call it equity, but it's not really an equity position. The investor doesn't really have any stake in the operation. The investor is basically getting a limited interest return on it, subordinated to capital that's in front of it. The capital that's in front of the investor certainly is going to be a first mortgage. It could also be a mezzanine loan from another lender. It could be a mezzanine loan from a government source, and then the only priority that the EB-5 investor gets is over any government grant capital or any government loans that can come in as a third position, and the equity of the equity investors. So it's a mixed bag, and I think that from the standpoint, I think where we want to try to get to is a situation where the investor can get good legal protection, and to the extent that the investor is going to be at risk, maybe there's a way for the investor to get some upsides from the project. Primarily, as you all know much better than I, investors are willing to come in and not get much of a return on their capital, and they're focusing on their green card. And that should be continuing to be the primary issue. And I think that developers have to become a lot more astute about how to help that happen and navigate the difficulties of going through the whole green card process and the USCIS reviews. And I think that without having a greater transparency on that process and a greater flexibility on the part of government, I think that's going to be a real limitation in terms of attracting capital. So first and foremost, you want to try to structure rules with whatever program, whatever new life the EB-5 program is going to take, that's going to give primary attention to achieving the primary goal of the investor, which is to get their green card and to get it as soon as possible. Secondly, however, there have been a number of defaults with EB-5 projects simply because there are defaults in the real estate industry, and particularly over the last year where the pandemic has put a lot of developers into sad shape, it's also had an impact on EB-5, which tends to be very low in the capital stack. And very often when these projects are taken over by the bank, there's no capital behind them to protect the EB-5 investor. So they suffer both the loss of their investment, and because they suffer the loss of their investment and the capital is no longer at risk, they lose their opportunity for the green card. So that problem has to be addressed, and I think it has to be marketed, but basically we have to offer real substance to the investor. Well, one of my own personal predilections is to look to try to give the EB-5 investors either a better return. As you probably know, it's mostly the agents and regional centers that take the bulk of the return, and the EB-5 investor gets a tiny little piece of it, and or to give them an opportunity to convert their investment into some kind of equity investment once they've achieved their green card. So I don't know if that fully answers your question or just a part of it. So I'll kick it back to you.
Well, Michael, I think it's important because a lot of our audience are potential investors that are looking for investment migration programs, not just in the United States, but all over the globe. And as you know, today there are over 40 different programs. I think it's really important for our investors to understand just how capital markets and financing of real estate projects work in the U.S. If you're investing in a project in India, you raise all the money and you go use cash to go build the development project. It's like that in many countries. So our institutional lending platforms for real estate projects are a lot different. You have a senior loan, mezzanine loan, sometimes even more subordinated than the mezzanine loan, and then you have equity. And I think it's very important for just to kind of at the basic level to explain to our investors how the different levels, what they mean from both the risk and return perspective, and just kind of explaining how the lower you are in the capital stack, the lower risk you have with the lower return, and maybe just kind of explaining all the way up to the capital stack. I think that would be helpful.
Very good. Okay, so here's Capital Stack 101. The starting point is the developer. What motivates all of these projects is a developer is looking to put together a project, either as a merchant developer to sell the units once it's completed, or to maintain it long range. And particularly those that are going to maintain it long range, they want to limit the amount of equity that they have in it. So the starting dynamics are, you have a project, let's say it costs $100 million. How do you raise $100 million? The essential part of that capital stack is going to be a mortgage loan. In U.S. projects, there's not a project that I know of, or I'm sure there's some that exist, but there's very few projects that are done with equity capital. Most of them have a mortgage loan. And that mortgage loan, what the lender or the provider of capital of that loan wants is a security of a first position, call it a lien. So they have a lien on the property, and they have the first position so that if their loan is not paid, they have the right to foreclose on the property, wipe out anybody behind them, and take over the project and put it through a process called foreclosure. And at the end of that process, they then sell the project on the market. And if they can't sell the project, they bid in on the mortgage themselves, and then they hold it, and then they can either try to redo the project themselves, or they can sell the project on the market. So in the current environment, you have two types of mortgage loans. One is a construction loan, and the other is a permanent loan. And the idea is that you need this capital. No, there are different types of lenders that provide capital for construction and provide capital for permanent loans. Usually it's institutional lenders that will provide the construction loan, and they will generally look to limit that loan to maybe 60 to 65% loan to value of the capital stack. So if you have a $100 million project, you're likely to tap out at 65%, maybe in a few instances you can push that up to 70%. So the developer at that point says, fine, I've got a good loan. Usually those loans are made at a prime or LIBOR plus, X percent above that. And so in today's environment, it's usually a floating rate, but with some kind of base to it. And generally speaking, right now in today's environment, I think you'd probably come out with about 6% interest only, for a typical construction loan in the first position. So let's say let's call Vanke as an example of a bank that provides construction loans, or the Ozarks used to be the big construction lender. Let's say that they provide $65 million of this $100 million project. The developer doesn't want to put up $35 million or 35% of the project, because equity is always the most expensive part of the project. So the developer is going to do two or three things. Ideally, the developer will go to government and say, I've got a great project. I want you to give me some assistance so I can both induce the lender to come in and show the lender that there's good capital behind it, and that the government is supporting this project, which doesn't have any real substance to it, but it gives a nice brand to it to have a little bit of government capital in. Most governments don't give capital. Most governments will give what they call offsets. Like New York City, for example, might give a real estate tax abatement. And what the real estate tax abatement does, it increases your net operating income, because it reduces your cost, and ultimately the amount of mortgage is based upon the net operating income. So you take a level usually the construction loans have two requirements. One is they'll rarely exceed 65% of cost, and secondly, they will also look to the future. If they're stuck with a project, they'll rarely exceed 65% of the appraised value of the property when it's completed. So you get to the appraised value of the property by first getting your net operating income, and then dividing that by a cap factor, and then that sets the maximum amount of mortgage. So what that really means, and this first occurred in the Commodore Hotel deal. The main reason the city gave a real estate tax abatement to the Trump organization was not because they loved the Trump organization, although we liked them at that time, because they were making investments when nobody else was making investments in the city, but to induce the lender to increase its loan from $40 million to $70 million. And because real estate taxes take a priority even over the mortgage, in other words, the priorities of the project, you first have to pay your taxes, And if you don't pay the taxes, the city will come in and foreclose and take the property, and then they'll put it up at tax foreclosure sale. The second priority, which we always call the first lien, but it's really second to taxes, is the mortgage itself. So when the lender's making a loan, the lender is going to look very carefully at the amount of real estate taxes in front of it, and that the amount of taxes also determines how much of a net operating income you will have. So to the extent you can reduce real estate taxes, you are increasing your net operating income, and therefore you're enabling the bank to make a larger loan, even considering the bank's normally rigorous criteria. And as I say, that was the technique that New York used to induce the Commodore, and for many years that was the technique that it used on a number of other projects. But there's also other ways of stimulating where the government can come in and help. They can give electrical benefits, which reduce the operating cost. They can give mortgage recording tax benefits or sales tax exemptions. So when you do a project, every state charges and locality charges sales taxes on the materials. Generally speaking, those materials are about the taxes on the materials come out to be around 4% of the total hard cost of the project. So if you're building a $100 million project, and maybe $60 million of that is in hard cost, and so 4% of the 60% is about $2.5 million, $2.4 million. I'm just running some numbers that may be inaccurate, but the concept is that if you get a sales tax abatement in the project that I've just described, you're basically saving $2.5 million of capital. And that $2.5 million of capital means that you have less equity to put in. So you can basically take that off of your equity. Some places like New York City have a very high mortgage recording tax, close to 3%. So if you're in the situation I'm describing here, where you have a $65 million mortgage, normally it would be 3% that you'd have to pay in mortgage recording taxes. Basically comes up to somewhat similar, a little bit over $2 million, maybe about $2.25 million. And if you save that, so that's also a savings off your equity. So New York City generally is using mortgage recording taxes and sales tax abatements as the primary tool. It doesn't give you capital, but it reduces your costs. And in the example we just used of a $100 million project, if you use the two of those together, it has the net effect of saving you close to $5 million of your $100 million project. And if you have $35 million of equity and you're saving $5 million, you're basically saving about 14% of your equity just from those two techniques. Ideally, though, what the developer looks for is capital, and capital to replace its own equity. And it can get capital. Ideally, it would get that capital in the form of a low-interest loan from a government. Usually states are a little bit more prominent in terms of providing capital rather than localities. Very few localities provide actual capital, either in the form of loans or grants. I'm trying to think of some examples of it. The city of Philadelphia, or actually the state of Pennsylvania, has a grant program called RACP. And you used to be able to get very large components of RACP. On my North Station District project, when Ed Rendell was the governor, we were able to get a commitment of $20 million of RACP for our overall project. And then we draw it down for each individual project that we would do. But that can provide interesting levels of capital. So, for example, on a first project that we were about to do, which was a $60 million residence for Temple medical students, we got a RACP of $4 million. So that meant that about 8% of our capital was provided by the state in the form of a grant, and that reduced the amount of equity that we had to provide by $4 million. So to the extent that you can get those grant programs, that's terrific. If you can't get a grant, there's many cities that do provide loans, again using Philadelphia. There's the Philadelphia Industrial Development Corporation, PIDC. They have a number of loan programs, low interest loans. You usually get loans for the rate of maybe 5%, and they usually take a mezz position, which means that they're behind the first mortgage. So let's use the example of the $100 million project that I just laid out. So you're starting off with $65 million of loan capital from the first mortgage. You then would have maybe a PIDC that would come in for, let's say this project was in Philadelphia, so I'll use the Philadelphia programs. You'd have a PIDC might come in for $5 million, so that takes you up to 70% of your capital stack. And then you might get a RACP grant. Let's say you get a RACP grant of $5 million, that takes you up to 75% of your capital stack. So just from those two programs, you've reduced the developer's equity from $35 million or 35% to 25%. That's the whole game to play here, to keep reducing that equity. But let's say you've exhausted all of those techniques, because increasingly states and cities are under fiscal pressure. In the two examples I used, RACP, it was reduced. I think it used to be $500 million a year statewide. It's now about $100 million a year. So it's much harder to get, and the grants are much smaller. And this is where EB-5 comes in. So with EB-5, there are really no limits, no legal limits on how much you can put in to the project. Generally, the investors will want as a rule of thumb, will want the developer to have in at least as much capital as they are putting in. So if you're raising $10 million of EB-5, the investor would like to see that the developer has at least $10 million behind them, because they're looking to protect their own position. So EB-5 is great because it really has the same impact as a mezzanine loan, as a PIDC loan. It's an investment, and you're paying an interest rate on it, but it's generally a much lower interest rate than you would have to pay in the private market. So for example, because of the issue that most lenders don't like to do an intercreditor agreement with EB-5 investors, because they don't really know who they're dealing with. They don't know if the regional center is going to be capable of coming in and running the project. So they generally don't want the EB-5 capital to have the ability to come in and take over the project. They will recognize a pref equity position, but they're not giving any legal status to that pref equity position. And what that means is that the pref equity position usually comes behind the first mortgage. It always comes behind the first mortgage, and it almost always comes behind any mezzanine capital that would come in. Every once in a while, you get a government program that's willing to subordinate to an EB-5. So, for example, PIDC is willing to take a third position. So PIDC, in many instances, will go in behind EB-5. PIDC is very interesting because it also is a partner in the Welcome Fund, which is one of the more successful regional centers in the country, and they're very familiar with that program, so they've been able to integrate a lot of their capital with EB-5 capital. So going back to the example that we had here, we're now up to a $75 million capital stack, with the first mortgage being $65 million, the second mortgage being PIDC being $5 million, and then a $5 million RACP grant. The nice part about the RACP grant, though, is that even if an EB-5 investor has to come in behind the mezz position, behind PIDC, who was ever in the mezz position, they are in front of both the equity project, the equity component, as well as the grant capital. So grant capital is great because it's terrific for everybody in that process, particularly the EB-5 investor. And that's why many EB-5 investors will look most favorably upon government programs, both because it seems to them, particularly the Chinese, who have a much more favorable attitude towards government, it seems to them that the government is giving its stamp of approval, but most important, it's putting in capital that is behind the EB-5 investors. So it gives the EB-5 investors some greater protection. To give one comparison, though, if the developer could not find any of this capital, and it had to go out and raise mezzanine capital, meaning the 65% that it's getting from the first lender is not sufficient. It doesn't have the capital itself to provide the 35%. There are many institutions and many lending entities that will provide mezzanine capital, but it's at a very high rate. And in today's environment, I think you'd pay at least 14% and probably closer to 18% interest rate, and maybe even a kicker on top of that for mezzanine capital. So for that reason, every developer, and including the EB-5 investors, because the EB-5 investors would be subordinated to that mezzanine capital, they want to be sure that the mezzanine capital, any capital in front of them, is as low rate as possible, so they're in a better protected position. So the last part of the capital stack, nobody really wants to use mezzanine lenders because they're too expensive. But on the other hand, if a developer has no other source of capital, he's going to go to the mezzanine investors. And that's where EB-5 becomes critically important. So we've now gotten to the point where we have $75 million of capital together in the illustration that I've just used, and the developer would like to get his capital down to, say, 12.5%, or $12.5 million. So we're $12.5 million short. That's where EB-5 could come in. So EB-5 theoretically can come in at any point of the capital stack. If, for example, there were no PIDC loan or there were no grant, the EB-5 capital would come in immediately behind the $65 million, and to get the developer down to 12.5%, which is really the driving force there, the EB-5 capital would have to pick up the difference between 65% and the 12 and the I guess 87.5%, which is what the capital stack would be after the developer's equity. So if you follow a general rule, which is not always the rule that's applicable, and say, okay, we've got $25 million left to finish the capital stack. Let's split that in half because the EB-5 investor wants to have in wants the developer to have in at least as much capital as it does. So in that case, the developer would put up $12.5 million, and the EB-5 would put up $12.5 million. The developer is very happy because the developer has a very small portion of equity in the project. It also has a $5 million grant, which it's not paying anything for, and that grant is subordinated. It has no position. It's simply a gift. The EB-5 investor is happy because while there's a loan and a mezz loan in front of it, the grant is behind it. So the EB-5 $12.5 million is behind $70 million of capital, which is the $65 million of the first mortgage and $5 million of the PIDC. But the $5 million grant from RACP is behind the EB-5. So that's sort of one very rough illustration of how the capital stack can come together. What are the dangers in it? Well, first of all, if the project goes sour, then either the mezz lender can come in and foreclose on everybody behind it, which means the EB-5 investor is out of pocket, gets wiped out as well as the developer, or the mezz lender can foreclose anyway, but the mezz lender can keep the project going by paying the first mortgage. So as long as the mezz lender is keeping the project alive and is keeping the first loan alive, that project continues, and the mezz lender really steps into the place of the developer and finishes up the project. If the mezz lender doesn't do that, then the first lender forecloses and everybody is wiped out. And in that wiping out process, the EB-5 investors have no status. In other words, the only recourse that they have is if either the mezz lender or the first lender forecloses and they put it up for sale. If the sale proceeds exceed the loan and the first lender gets paid off, then that loan is dispersed out, according to the next people in the capital stack. So what that really means is that the EB-5 investor is taking the same risk as the developer, although it's ahead of the developer in the process. But quite frankly, the developers are pretty slick, and they're smarter than many of the investment groups. And most developers figure out a way that they can somehow squeeze ahead of the EB-5, maybe by redeploying the money. That's what this, I think what we're getting at is in talking about the capital stack, getting into some of the dynamics of the negotiations between the developer, the lenders, the sources of capital, and the EB-5 investors. And I think that in order to, my position was always that I think the EB-5 investors really need some real estate expertise in terms of putting their deals together. Some regional centers have that. Most don't really have it. A lot of the regional centers come out of the financial services industries, but most of them come out of the immigration field. And I think what's really missing in this process to protect the investor and maybe even get a better piece for the regional centers is for those regional centers to act as if they are developers and at least be able to get in the game and do the negotiation that a developer would have. I don't know if I covered everything, but
No, you covered a lot, and it's very helpful, and I think our audience are really going to appreciate, the in-depth, dive into capital stacks and how the dynamics work. Obviously, there's, a lot of much more complicated capital stacks, and then there are much easier capital stacks where there's a senior construction loan, a mezzanine EB-5 loan, and equity. But, I've done transactions where, there was a senior loan, there was mezzanine EB-5 loan. Actually, I did a transaction where EB-5 was senior loan, and then there was historical tax credits, and then there was investors on historical taxes, both federal and state, and then there was TIP financing from the city. So there was like 8 different financing sources, and those type of transactions get complicated. But I think it's great for us to explain to the audience just kind of the simple transaction, typical EB-5 transaction, up and down the capital stack, how that works. One of the things you mentioned, I think, I have a lot of experience kind of negotiating with the senior lenders, and you're right. I think a lot of senior lenders don't like having to deal with 200 families, for example, and they don't want to have EB-5 group as a mezzanine loan because they don't want 200 families to foreclose on the project without development experience. But they are lenient. I think if the regional center is a group that does have either financial experience or development experience, I think they are likely to allow EB-5 to be in a mezzanine position. So I think in the early days there were definitely a lot of EB-5 that was structured in the preferred equity position, but in the last 5 or 6 years, most of the EB-5 projects have been structured in the mezzanine position as more senior lenders have become more cognizant that some of the regional centers are sophisticated to have development expertise, and they do have the ability to foreclose and take over the project and finish it in the event of a default. The other thing that you mentioned, I think it was really interesting. In 1975, I guess when you worked from the economic development side on the Commodore Hotel, there was no EB-5. But I think it's interesting that former President Trump actually didn't have all the financing lined up, and you helped him kind of come up with that. You want to spend a couple of minutes maybe talking about how what he had, what he didn't have, and how you were able to think outside the box and come up with additional financing to get that project done.
right. Well, what's interesting about that, oh, and by the way, just one comment to finalize or to add to what you just said about the lender's position. Most lenders don't want to foreclose. The last thing in the world that a bank wants to do is get in the real estate business. And first of all, it means their capital is going to be tied up and be unproductive while they're going through an elaborate foreclosure proceeding, and even a simple one, and certainly where there's going to be challenges, where the developers are putting up all kinds of defenses. The last thing in the world a lender wants to do is run a real estate project, and even they don't want to go through a foreclosure proceeding if they can avoid it. So I think the process could be helped considerably if there was an integration between good development capacity and regional centers or whoever is packaging the loan, which really means either the regional centers themselves have to be capable of handling that real estate and convincing the lenders that they can step into the project and run it and keep it out of foreclosure, or what might be a more likely situation is joint ventures between a regional center and a real estate company. So, for example, Abteen, we're working very closely with Silverstein Properties. They have a development management company that most banks would recognize as having great expertise, and they also know something about EB-5. So if they were to connect with, on a consulting basis, with a regional center, I think that would be a much more attractive proposition to the banks in terms of recognizing the EB-5 position. So just just that comment. And
I have just a quick follow-up on that, and I think Priya has some more questions. But you mentioned an interesting point that a lot of times the developers are pretty slick. I think in the cases of some of the developers where they're the EB-5 regional center, essentially they're the borrower and the lender. So it's tough, because there's definitely a conflict of interest. If it's a big reputable developer, I think a lot of investors trust them in that regard. But I think that actually outlines an important point that the group you're dealing with as a regional center is not also the lender and the borrower, where a lot of developers have a regional center arm where they're raising money for their own projects, but there are also groups that are raising money for third-party projects, and they keep the developer honest to make sure that the transaction is you know I guess they're there's an arms length transaction, and they're heavily um, you know maybe you want to talk about the difference between developers that are also regional centers and then third party developers.
okay. So I guess I should go back to your question about the what Trump was looking for and in that process and how that capital stack was put together. I think at that time there was far less sophistication about all kinds of mezzanine financing and grants. The city, up until that point, had not given any incentives whatsoever to commercial development. Their programs had been, up until '76, social programs or industrial programs because New York, like many other cities at that time, were losing industry. So there were no programs whatsoever to induce developers to do a commercial project like a hotel. Uh, Therefore, what we came up with was the mechanism that was most directly related to putting the capital stack together, which was a real estate tax abatement. Because what the bank was concerned about is more, and this was really related in part to the timing of when that project was done, because the bank, I think the taxes were $3 million, or would have been, full taxes would have been $3 million a year. So that really relates to maybe, depending on a 5 cap, that might relate to about $60 million worth of value. So basically, if you convert that into an NOI impact, so basically the bank was saying, wow, that's a big impact to be behind. And because of that, and I think the project costs were only in the range of $80 million, $85 million. The ultimate loan, the $70 million, went well beyond what today's standards were of 65% loan to cost. I think the bank's loan covered really the whole bulk of the project, particularly since Trump was able to get the land at a very cheap cost and contribute the land. Probably he overvalued the equity of it in terms of getting an appraised value on that equity because he was dealing with the bankrupt institution, that Penn Central. And so we were really focused on how to induce the bank to come in to provide that capital stack. And the quickest and easiest way was to give not only an abatement of the taxes, but a fixed rate. Because what the bank was really concerned about is if the city went bankrupt, which was a real possibility then, the trustees could raise the real estate taxes through the roof. The trustees would take over on behalf of the bondholders, and they would raise real estate taxes across the city to make sure that the bondholders got paid. So the bank was giving a very, very low loan-to-cost loan, primarily because they were concerned about the volatility of the real estate rates. So we really structured this not only to give an abatement, which an abatement could be a certain percentage of the taxes. Like in Philadelphia, they give a 10-year abatement, and they're going to skew that now. They're going to make it a 10-year abatement, but a sliding scale where it reduces 10% per year. But if the tax base goes up, that abatement is worth less because they're not giving you a fixed rate. They're really telling you, well, we're going to charge you 10% each year of what the taxes would have been, but the full taxes could skyrocket if the city of Philadelphia gets into fiscal trouble. So the critical issue of that program was we gave a fixed amount. not a portion of the taxes. And one of the big issues that I had when I was trying to sell this, because part of this, the first difficulty was making a deal with Donald Trump, which took a while, but that was fun, and that was it. And he came away saying he got the best deal, and we think we got the best deal. History will tell. But the biggest part of it was selling the deal to the political figures that had to approve it, as well as to stakeholders, because every other developer in the city was saying, "Hey, why are you giving it to that guy? Is it because he comes from the Brooklyn administration and the city is giving him a favorable deal?" And I said, "This is easy. I'll give you the same deal. You invest in the city, and we'll give you the same exact deal that we gave Trump." Nobody took that deal because nobody was willing to make the investment. But during that process, people were saying, "Well, you're being taken advantage of," and of course they had a saying like some of the old time Jewish developers would say, "Boychik, he's taking your pants," and I would say, and he says, "Trump doesn't have any money in this. He's going to cash out on this deal. He doesn't have any investment in this. He's probably got a contract with Penn Central that has no money down, and if he gets the deal, he'll go forward, but he's got nothing at risk." I say, that tells me he's a smart developer, and I'm not disturbed by that. What I want is somebody who's going to invest some money in the city. The city's going to do everything possible to help them because we really were in a crisis situation. And if he's good enough to get this without any money, even if he gets it all from the bank, we don't care. We only care about two things. Number one, we want to save the jobs of the Commodore that was shut down, which was 1,400 jobs. Number two, we want to see new investment, particularly at that time, that Grand Central area was starting to go like Times Square, where there were pornography uses coming in. The Chrysler building had just gone into foreclosure. That was the environment. So we want to see that. And third, what we really want from them, which was the biggest part of my negotiation, was we want to put in a hotel that will attract convention business. So we sort of forced him into doing a deal with Hyatt, which he didn't want to do, and it turned out to be a difficult partnership all along, because what we really wanted was a hotel in there that would create a reservation service that would bring convention business to the city. And that accomplished it all. So I think, in retrospect, I don't really know the numbers. I don't know whether the $70 million loan covered most, if not all, of the capital stack. I imagine Trump had some equity capital in there, and I'm sure he probably brought in some third-party sources to provide the equity. But at that time, there was no mechanism other than the pilot to provide any capital substitutes. We didn't have any loan programs. At that time, we did have the sales tax abatement and the mortgage recording tax abatement that was part and parcel along with the pilot mechanism, the payment in lieu of taxes. But I don't think we gave the sales tax or mortgage recording tax abatement to them. I'd have to go back to my records and check. Nowadays, it's a much more complicated deal, both because there are very few cities that like to give tax abatements. When you give a tax abatement, the city covers all of that money and all of the risk. And the arguments we usually make with cities is that, well, this project wouldn't be built if you don't give the tax abatement. So now you're getting zero taxes. It's better for you to get some taxes. But the cities are saying, okay, but we have to pay 100% of those taxes. With other components, particularly like sales tax abatements, you're sharing that with the state or you're sharing that with the county, with other jurisdictions, so that's easier to get. There was a period of time when cities and states had capital to add to the capital stack. That's still there. It wasn't there in '76, but it's still there, but to a much lesser degree.
The comment about dealing with regional centers that are arms like transactions, or regional centers that are owned by developers.
I'm sorry, Abteen, could you repeat that?
Yeah, sorry. The last question in that line of questioning was, the difference between dealing with a regional center that is not part of a development group and versus dealing with a development group that has their own regional centers that may have a conflict of interest in EB-5 transaction.
Oh, okay. So for example, uh, I guess there's certain large New York developers that basically control their own regional centers. Uh, I I think from a public policy standpoint, that's less desirable. I think because those entities, and I really think what happened, and one of the reasons why New York City got a disproportionate amount of capital, is because you had a number of very large, very competent and well-connected developers that had projects and they were able to set up their own marketing organizations. And if a Chinese investor has a chance between going into, let's say, Hudson Yards, which is a terrific project and a very high profile project in a great area, but still got a TEA designation, or going into the South Bronx, you know which project they're going to pick. So I think from a public policy standpoint, I'm less against a developer having its own regional center. My real objective would be to see EB-5 capital used in impacted areas and to really make a transformation. From that standpoint, if a developer is willing and able to do that, um, let him take every advantage there is, including setting up his own regional center. Probably on a deeper level, there is a conflict of interest, but I'm not sure I fully understand that conflict. And in any case, I tend to look at what the results are rather than the more moral issue of whether there's a conflict here. But that's just my personal view.
I think one of the more interesting topics, which is more common these days in EB5, is redeployment, and that conflict of interest that might exist between a developer who, say, wants to refinance a project, but needs to redeploy EB5 funds to keep those funds at risk if the immigration process is not complete yet. Can you talk a little bit more about that conflict of interest specifically?
Well, that's a particularly difficult one. I agree with you, and I'm still a little confused by how the whole redeployment functions, but I do know that one of the major regional centers that controls, tremendous amounts of capital is really looking at that as a financial play. They borrowed the money very cheaply, and they're looking to redeploy it at a very substantial increase in pricing and the interest rate. So let's say, for example, that they got the EB-5 capital for 4 or 5%, just to pick a number. And now, if they're redeploying it, they want the entity that's taking that redeployment to pay them 8 or 9% interest. So they're taking a spread. That's a very good business model, but I don't think it's in tune with the public policy. I don't think it helps in any way the investors. The investors aren't getting any piece of that. And so what it does, it simply puts the investor into a different project than they originally, counted on. They contemplated certain levels of risk. Their problem is caused by the fact that the USCIS has not processed the applications fast enough. So in most cases, they're in a retrogression issue, and they're stuck. They're not getting their green card in 5 years. Their capital has to remain at risk. So because of the government-caused problem, they are now at the mercy of the developers. On the one hand, the developers, in most cases, are required to keep the capital at risk, and they can't use it themselves. So they're just going to look to, get out of that obligation as easily as possible and maybe even make a profit out of it. And I'm sure what occurs, every situation is going to be a little bit different. I'm not sure I could make any broad sweeping judgments about, redeployment generally. You'd have to look at each particular situation. But I know I've been trying to find redeployment capital for a couple of projects where we were short of EB-5, and it's really hard to find that. I think there's a gap in the market between what the providers of redeployment capital are looking for, what buyers of redeployment capital would be willing to pay for it, and perhaps most important, how do you take care of the investor and protect the investor? Are you improving the investor's position, or are you decreasing the investor's position?
Yeah, I think on the redeployment side, the fact that it's already hard to find the redeployment capital. Another thing I think that made it even tougher, I think in October 2020, the USCIS actually stepped back from the previous rule, which was you could redeploy anywhere, and you didn't have to create new jobs because the original project created jobs. They actually added a new requirement that now said, you can only redeploy in the original region where the original project is. So that makes it a lot harder to match between the projects that need redeploying and the new projects, because that really tremendously reduces the amount of projects that are available for redeployment. And I think that's actually it's not consistent with what the previous understanding was. So many developers and regional center operators, operated their businesses on the assumption that they could redeploy it to a certain project, and then the rule overnight changed and made it much more restrictive. So that's something I think that the USCIS still needs to address, and there's definitely a lot of questions in that regard.
You know what? You're stimulating a thought here, which I never considered before. But I think the real solution to this is for the government to remove the rule that the capital has to remain at risk until the green card is issued. When an investor came in, the real bargain was, hey, I'll tie up my capital for X years, I'll get a very low return on it, and then I'll get my capital paid back. So the risk that they're taking is during that period, let's call it 5 years. During that period, their capital is at risk. The project may or may go into default, and that's a legitimate economic risk. But now their capital is being tied up for 10 years and maybe more. And then they become subject to a redeployment that might put them into a riskier situation. The only real solution to that, which will eliminate the profit taking as well as being fair to the investor, and I think will ultimately stimulate a better market, is to remove that requirement of keeping the capital at risk for until the green card is issued. The capital should be at risk until the project reaches a certain level of stability and/or a certain amount of time. Let's say a fixed time, like 5 years. I don't know if when they're considering the new bill, if they're considering that, but that's probably the best way to solve the redeployment issue. And certainly, I think it's the best signal to send to investors that the government's going to look out for their interest.
I was just going to say, I totally agree with you. I think, there needs to be some evolution there because obviously when they first started the program, the processing times were not so long at all. And it's actually the processing times that have dragged out the immigration process to beyond 5 years at this point is why we're having to see all this redeployment happening. So I do think there's some evolution that needs to happen there in terms of maybe changing that rule to match the current timelines of the immigration process.
Sure.
And Michael, to your point also, I think I agree with you. I think there definitely needs to be more protections for the investors, and there just really aren't. The USCIS is not really equipped as an investor protection organization. They're an immigration organization, part of the Department of Homeland Security, and the SEC. They try to do their part, but really we need some changes on the legislative front. This latest bill that unfortunately didn't get approved in the Senate and the House, had some integrity measures, and two of the most important ones that I think are important. One is requiring regional centers and projects to have fund administrators instead of traditional escrows, or not even have any kind of escrow mechanism where the money is just given to a developer and they can do whatever they want with it. Those are some of the cleanup measures that was in that last bill, which required to have fund administrators. And now investors' funds are tracked, and they're handled by a third party. And then the other really important part, and as you know, many construction lenders have this, is the ability to have construction draws, and that would really eliminate a lot of the fraud. In the old days, and that's still the law of the land. A developer or a regional center could raise 100 million, hand that 100 million over to the developer, and we've seen some instances where the developer may not have been the most trustworthy, or the regional center may not have been the most trustworthy, and they've taken those funds and bought, yachts and private jets with it. Where if you have construction draws, and that's how construction lenders operate, if you raise 100 million and they're building a $100 million project, they have to show you that, hey, I spent $5 million on concrete. You show the receipt and you get reimbursed. Or I spent $10 million on steel, and you show those receipts, and they verify that, and those draws are made, as opposed to just handing cash over to some of these developers. And by having those two integrity measures, you really eliminate a lot of these instances of fraud, and you really protect investors. But unfortunately, some of those integrity measures that were in that bill, the bill didn't pass, and hopefully there will be some renewed negotiations both on the Senate side and the House side to 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 bring those integrity measures. But also our friends in New York that that oppose that bill, they have a great point. Their point is, if you want to clean up the EB-5 program, you got to reduce the wait times and the backlog and retrogression, and that would really solve the problem, a lot of the problems. And they're correct too. I think all of us in the EB-5 industry want this industry to be improved, to be the best for the investors, and also to be much easier for developers to be able to utilize this and to bring those foreign investment dollars, which before it used to be only one or two games in town. Today there are 40 different countries that are competing with us, and many of them, you get a residency that's not really worth anything. I think to have a U.S. passport and have access to 200 plus unique elite universities in the United States, where we're competing against someone in Cyprus. What university do they have in Cyprus or Malta? So I think it's much better value to have a U.S. residency, and I think if we can be the catalyst for change for Congress to enact some of those integrity measures to protect investors, it will make the program much more popular.
Well, I think this is turning into a very interesting policy discussion because I think what we're saying here in different ways is that we got to go back to the basic principles. As I'm looking at it, this program really was simulated to draw capital into ignored areas of the U.S., the Appalachia, rural areas that were dying, inner cities. Very little of the capital is going there. Also, as a general principle, the first rule of any business should be protect your investors. Investors are sacred. You look out for their interest. And the good developers who have remained in and have become household names are those that protect their investors, that they don't take advantage of them. I think that this program was hijacked by both, if I can be a little difficult, hijacked by the regional centers who are basically financial packagers and are taking, we're able to see a good business opportunity in terms of packaging deals and getting in the middle and taking essentially a good broker's fee. But more, it was hijacked by the developers. The developers have changed the program that was meant to benefit, that was meant to provide opportunities for investors and bring talented people into the U.S., not just their initial investment, but also the contributions that they would make. If you believe in immigration, you're really getting the cream of the crop of the immigrants through this program. But it was also meant to provide capital to places that weren't getting capital. It has not achieved either of those. And I think that if we're able to get a new bill through, going back to the principle of combining the EB-5 program with opportunity zones, and particularly there has to be some mechanism that's missing right now, because opportunity zones are drawn pretty broadly, and not every investment in an opportunity zone is a transformational investment. So how do you really provide advantages to the developer and the EB-5 investor and even the regional center to invest that capital in the places where it's really needed, where it's really going to make a difference? And in doing that, how do you provide better protections or returns for the investors? I think the market has to now consider not only giving them greater protections in terms of the capital stack and better protections against foreclosure by having a real capacity to do something if the developer goes sour, but also maybe getting a greater return, for taking that level of risk, and particularly if you're going into opportunity zones where the risks are higher, and you want to offset those risks by getting supplementary capital in from the various governments, including the federal government. How do you also give a greater reward to those investors? Again, their primary goal is to get their green card, but the truth is, if their capital is going to be tied up, compared to a mezz position of 14, 15, 18% that returns that they're getting, the investors are getting a very small amount. They should get something more.
Yeah, Michael, another thing I think that's important, I think, as the EB-5 program first started in the early 1990s, majority of capital, I think something like 50, 60% of the capital was going to the state of California. Many smaller developers and also, immigration attorneys that had kind of figured out this program were using, utilizing EB-5 capital, and they were building projects. But 10, 15 years, the majority of the money went to California, but it was kind of under the radar. And then, after the Great Recession in 2007, as, you know, real estate financing and just lending kind of completely dried down, many developers started looking at alternative sources of capital, and a lot of developers, especially in New York City in the 2012, 13, 14, started looking at alternative capital and EB-5 to raise in funds. And I think and then, it kind of started shifting. Instead of 50, 60% of the money overall in the whole country going to California, they started going to New York, and not just New York State, but really New York City. And that really started kind of putting the EB-5 front and center. I think a lot of different senators in different states started paying attention to it, and that's where really the disputes arose, that maybe one company and one particular developer in New York was raising more money than most of the other states combined. I think that's what really created a lot of the challenges and a lot of the fights that have been going on in the industry. But at the core of it, I look at EB-5 as a tool to provide financing to lower income communities. And the Opportunity Zone program is almost identical, and the only difference really between Opportunity Zones and EB-5 is, in one, you provide economic activity to lower income area, you get immigration benefits. The other one, you provide economic activity to low income area, and you get tax incentives. So essentially, you can have these programs coincide and work together. And I think maybe you create an Opportunity Zone program where instead of getting tax benefits, you get immigration benefits. So there are definitely ways to tweak the program, but at the core of it, I think that you mentioned it, are the investor protections that just haven't been enacted. And the SEC is too busy, and it's more kind of a rear view focused. They're more focusing on frauds that happened 4 or 5 years ago, as opposed to try to kind of get developers and the industry to avoid future frauds. But I think through legislation and through integrity measures and through different stakeholders and different organizations and Congress working together, we can achieve those goals, clean up the program. But there's no other country that's as unique and as wanted as the United States, particularly given the fact that most of the investors that are coming to the EB-5 program are looking to be business owners, and what better country to start a business than the United States? And then they're looking for their kids to attend, secondary education, and no country on earth has as many, elite universities as the United States. So, hopefully we can tweak some of those and have a great future for the EB-5 industry. But over the next month, we'll find out, some of those efforts in Congress.
Well, I'm going to ask you a question now because you raise a very interesting point for both you and Preeya. Do you think those integrity measures, it's always hard to get the government to protect investors on integrity measures. The SEC does a good job but it's got a different mission. To what degree do you think an institution like IIUSA could be a force in upgrading the integrity measures? Because basically this is a business, and to the extent your investors don't trust you, you have no business. So as the institution that is sort of front and center of this whole program, for whether it's the regional centers or sources of capital or anybody that joins IIUSA, to what degree can an institution like that be effective in creating a new marketplace?
I think so. There's various stakeholders, it's not just IIUSA. So IIUSA is the nonprofit trade group for EB-5 regional centers and stakeholders. There's also the Investment Coalition. They've done a wonderful job in trying to get the investors and developers and regional centers' interests move forward. There's also the Rural Alliance. There's the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. There's the Realtors Lobby. I think there's American Hotel Lodging Association, the Asian American Hotel Lodging Association. There's definitely a lot of stakeholders, and there are a lot of groups from the various different parts doing their job to try to influence cleanup measures, and then also make it what I see Investment Coalition is doing is very important, because they say, okay, well you're doing these integrity measures, but they don't fix the existing problems, which is the backlog and having additional visas and the long processing times. And they have a very valid point. I think everyone in the industry wants the same things, but I think they just have different processes on how they think they can get that done. But at the end of the day, IIUSA, IC, the Rural Alliance, a lot of these organizations, they have a certain amount of influence, and they have educational responsibilities to kind of explain to the industry what these integrity measures mean. But at the end of the day, I think you have to have the will from Congress, especially on the Senate side, to want to improve the program and move forward. And unfortunately, from the nonprofit trade organizations, there's only so much you could do. At the end of the day, the various influential senators will have to have the want to improve the program and increase its capacity.
I think at the end of the day, everyone wants the same thing. It would be great to have a program. I mean, especially from my point of view, sitting here in Dubai, I work with investors every single day, and it's my job to sort of sell this program as a good program. So I think having a program that has those integrity measures that helps protect investors obviously is something that most people want, and it would make for a better industry. Do I think we have a little bit of ways to get there? Yes, I do. But we'll see how that unfolds as, as the negotiations continue.
And I think what happens over the next month is going to be really important. Obviously, Michael, you know about the lawsuit by the federal magistrate that essentially brought the price down to 500,000 and the rules back to the previous
Right.
previous to November 2019 rules. But at the end of the day, the program is a sunset, so there is no regional center program as of today. Hopefully, there'll be a negotiation in Congress and they'll bring that back. But the direct program, which doesn't have an expiration date, that program is valid today, and there's actually a lot of interest in it. Although Preeya and I had an episode last episode. We talked about the challenges, how hard it is to get jobs counted through the direct program, and how it really has a fit for smaller projects, smaller franchise or restaurant projects. But there is definitely a new interest, and we're hoping that Congress you know just does the right thing and reenacts the program and brings the regional center program back. Thank you, Michael, for joining us and sharing some of your insights. It's definitely been a pleasure having you on, and we look forward to our continued discussion in the future.
Well, thank you very much. It's been my honor and pleasure to join you, to meet Priya, to continue my relationship with you. And I think there was a very interesting discussion here. I learned as much or more as I contributed, so I thank you for that. And I think we now have a great challenge that could be a great opportunity, which is to take some of these insights and make sure that we move them in the right direction and bring these programs together and take them back to, what the original policies were. So I look forward, hopefully, to working with you both towards that end.
Thank you, Michael.